to the Festival of Arts and Sciences 2012. It's so great to have you here today. We are privileged. We have Professor Alan Brinkley from Columbia speaking to us, historian, speaking to us about the Great Depression then and now. Alan, I had learned recently, he's such a great example, please forgive me, Alan, but when he rose to provost at Columbia, he hadn't applied and he was asked. It was not out of ambition, it was out of dedication and service that he took that post for 6 years. And I know he's recently returned to faculty. But really to see this humility wedded with great confidence, it's not, those two attributes don't always come together. So we're just privileged to have you here with us. But before I introduce Alan, President Pro Morales has some words of welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. I just wanted to add my words of welcome to all of you here today. The Festival of the Liberal Arts and Sciences has been going on for quite many years here at Middlesex County College, and it's the time of the year when we get to have the opportunity to reflect upon and have some discourse about things that are going on in our country today and how things that are going on in our country today connect with our past and our present and hopefully to our future. A good community college like we are has two very important aspects. We have our career programs, which I believe are always the heart of our institution, but our liberal arts programs are really the soul of our institution. And we are here today to maybe examine and put some things into our soul and think about how we are operating as citizens in this country. So I welcome you all. I know that many of you are here with your history classes, and that's a wonderful thing. My husband is a historian, so I know how important history is. And I welcome you, and I hope that you have an opportunity to listen, to reflect, and to perhaps ask some questions. So have a good afternoon, and thank you for coming this afternoon.
Thank you, President Pro Morales. Really, today we're continuing our look into this foment and change, what we're calling a cultural apocalypse. Things happening worldwide, and we are looking hopefully toward the emergence of something new. Alan Brinkley. Alan Brinkley is the Alan Devens Professor of History and former Provost at Columbia University. He's the author of The Voices of Protest, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, and the Great Depression, which won the 1983 National Book Award. The End of Reform, New Deal Liberalism and Recession and War, and Liberalism and Its Discontents. His most recent books are Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the publisher Henry Luce and His American Century. Alan's educated at Princeton and Harvard. He taught at MIT, Harvard, and the City University Graduate School before joining the Columbia faculty in 1991. In 1998 and 1999, he was a Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford University. He won the Joseph R. Levinson Memorial Teaching Award at Harvard in 1987 and the Great Teacher Award at Columbia in 2003. Alan is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Humanities Center in Oxford University Press, and chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Century Foundation. He's been a visiting professor at Princeton, the School of Advanced Studies in Social Science in Paris, and the University of Torino. He was the 1988-1999 Harmsworth Professor of American History Award at Oxford University. Alan, thank you so much for coming. Looking forward to it.
Thank you for these very nice introductions, and thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And I'm very pleased to have a glance at this beautiful campus, so it's really nice to be here. Today I want to talk about two Great Depressions in America. Both were severe and long-lasting, and both of them have spread throughout much of the world. One of these depressions took place in the 1930s, and the other is the great economic crisis of our own time. So today I want to pose and try to answer three large questions that face those who have tried to understand the Great Depressions. First, what caused the Great Depression? Second, why did it last so long? And third, what, if any, lessons we can learn from the past for the crisis of our own time. So let me start with what caused the Great Depression in the 1930s. There's never been any broad agreement on what has caused the Great Depression. Robert Lucas, a prominent economist at the University of Chicago, who has at one time or another supported various theories of the causes of the Depression, he ultimately decided, however, that the Great Depression is inexplicable by any rational calculation, that no one knows why the Great Depression occurred. But despite the difficulties, there are a number of explanations that have attracted broad support, each of which I think has something to contribute to understanding the Depression. Explanations that are in many ways eerily similar to the problems of our own time. So first, inequality. National wealth and national income were increasing dramatically in the 1920s, but large groups of the population were either not sharing in that increase at all, as was the case for most farmers, or were sharing it at a very disproportionately low level, as was the case for most of the industrial workforce. More than 2/3 of the American people were too poor to buy the goods that were being produced at anything like the rate at which they were being produced. The theory of the causes of the Great Depression is often called underconsumption. People just didn't have enough money to buy the goods that the country was producing. Second, a lack of diversification. The 1920s economy was based disproportionately on a few large industries, notably construction and automobiles. Both of these sectors suffered major declines towards the end of the 1920s. The construction and automobile industries had grown dramatically after World War I to satisfy a sudden initial demand in the early and mid-1920s, especially a demand for houses and cars, often from first-time buyers. That demand tapered off late in the decade when most people who could afford houses and cars had already bought them. And there were no other emerging sectors in the economy strong enough yet to compensate for the decline of housing and automobiles. That was part of the beginning of the Depression. Third, in 1932, not long before Franklin Roosevelt entered office, the members of the Federal Reserve Board saw the economic wreckage around them and responded by raising interest rates so as to protect the solvency of the Federal Reserve Bank itself. No one today would even consider raising interest rates in a deflationary economy. The economist Milton Friedman wrote an essay on the Depression of the 1960s that he entitled Great Contraction. And he placed much of the blame for this contraction of the money supply on the flawed monetary policies of the Federal Reserve Board. And fourth, and perhaps most visible, financial speculation. The rise in speculation in the United States in the late 20s was driven in large part by the movement of new middle-class investors into the stock market. Beginning in February 1928, the market began a sudden and dramatic climb which continued with no major interruptions for a year and a half. The Great Bull Market, as it was called, created a kind of speculative fever that brought many new investors into the market. Trading mushroomed from about 2 to 3 million shares a day to 2 to 5 and 6 million shares, and on some days up to as much as 10 and 12 million shares being sold. This was a remarkably rapid growth. The number of investors, once only a small number of affluent people, exploded, quadrupling the number of investors, many of whom were not affluent at all. Thousands of salesmen spread across the country, selling securities, stocks that is, widely, and by the 1920s they were providing large loans to investors who counted on rising stock prices to allow them to pay back their debts. And of course, when the stock market crashed, these speculative investments disappeared, leaving hundreds of thousands of investors owing the banks for the loans they had made and that they could never pay back. By the winter of 1932, a nationwide panic was underway that threatened to destroy the entire structure of the economy. The stock market lost over 80% of its value. More than 9,000 banks either went bankrupt or suspended operations to avoid bankruptcy between 1930 and 1933. Depositors lost $2.5 billion in deposits. Partly as a result of the banking collapse, there was a dramatic decline in the money supply. By one measurement, money supply, which is accounted for by cash and checking accounts, money supply fell by over 25% in 3 years starting in 1929. By another measurement, which includes cash, checking accounts, and savings, the money supply fell by over 33%. A declining money supply means, of course, deflation and declining purchasing power and declining economic activity. Any of these problems would have damaged the American economy in 1929, but what made the crisis so disastrous was that all of these problems emerged more or less together. So the second question I want to ask is, why did the Great Depression last so long? The Great Depression was almost 4 years old when Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1933. He knew that his first and most important goal was to end it. He sought that goal in many different ways, and he helped the economy in many ways, but he never ended the Depression. Among his first achievements in 1933 was to raise the confidence and optimism that was so important to any efforts to allow the nation to believe that the future might be better. Roosevelt invited frightened Americans to put their trust in his own energy and activism. In his inaugural address, he promised action and action now. And to a large degree, he delivered on that promise. The frenzy of activity and innovation that marked those first months, a welcome contrast to the seeming paralysis of the discredited Herbert Hoover regime, helped accomplish the first and perhaps most important task that Roosevelt faced, ending the panic that was gripping the nation. It helped that his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, was so discredited and unpopular that it gave Roosevelt an excuse to blame the previous administration for the emergence of the Depression, and he continued to use Hoover as a scapegoat for years. Unlike Hoover, who hewed to a few rigid principles, Roosevelt entered office with a belief in what he called pragmatic experimentation. He was mostly without strong convictions or principles, and he was often criticized, both at the time and since, for his apparent absence of conviction. He was, the historian Richard Hofstadter once wrote, he was content in large measure to follow public opinion, and thus cleared no clear path. Such complaints were common among Roosevelt's contemporaries as well, most of all among those who had invested the greatest hopes in him. There seemed to many people that there was something almost slippery about Franklin Roosevelt. eagerness to please everyone with whom he talked, and with his tendency to allow seemingly contradictory initiatives to proceed simultaneously. Roosevelt's fundamentally political nature, his rejection of all but a few fixed principles, and his inclination to measure each decision against its likely popular reaction, that may have been a significant weakness, as some of Roosevelt's critics have claimed, or his greatest strength, as others insist. But it was the essence of the man. Critics and admirers alike have argued that the New Deal reflected nothing but pragmatic responses to immediate problems. But it also reflected Roosevelt's instinct for action, his belief in, if nothing else, the obligation of the leaders of government to work aggressively and affirmatively to deal with the nation's problems. Take a method and try it, Roosevelt liked to say. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. Roosevelt also moved quickly and effectively to address the most dangerous financial crisis of the Great Depression, and that was the wave of bank failures that was threatening to shut down the financial system altogether, just as the financial system almost shut down in 2008. The largest number of failures occurred in the weeks just preceding Roosevelt's inauguration. On his first day in office, he proclaimed a bank holiday, a euphemism for shutting down all the banks. And a day later, he signed the Emergency Banking Act, which allowed instructors to evaluate troubled banks and decide whether or not they could reopen. Later, in 1933 and 1934, the Glass-Steagall Acts created barriers between commercial and investment bankings to protect depositors from the volatility of the equity markets. Glass-Steagall also established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed that citizens would never lose their bank deposits, even if a bank failed. Shoring up the banks was one of the most important achievements of the New Deal. Without it, an already crippled economy could have spiraled even further downward. In creating the Securities and Exchange Commission, he also helped make the beleaguered stock market more transparent and thus more trustworthy. The New Deal also responded vigorously to one of the greatest problems of the Great Depression, an unemployment rate that had reached 25%. And in some cities, some industrial cities, Toledo, Akron, Detroit, and other centers of heavy industry, those cities had unemployment as much as 75%. In the first year of the new administration, Congress created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which helped shore up exhausted state and local relief agencies, and also helped create more employment. It also created the Civil Works Administration, which hired the unemployed to work for the government, sometimes on significant capital projects and sometimes just on menial activities, but always in ways that channeled money to people who needed it. At the same time, the Public Works Administration began what became more than a decade-long process of building infrastructure projects: dams, hydroelectricity, harbors, roads, and many other programs. Over time, these projects help support long-term economic activity in areas that previously had few prospects of growth. 2 years later, the New Deal created the Works Progress Administration, the most extensive federal work relief program ever created, which kept an average of 2 million people employed throughout its 8-year history. By the end of the third year of the New Deal, unemployment had declined from 25% to just over 16%, a significant improvement, but nevertheless still a very high level of unemployment. In 1935, With his re-election approaching, and with the Depression still in progress, Roosevelt launched what has often been called the Second New Deal, a period of activism comparable to the first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration, but in many respects, much more productive. It produced the Social Security Act, which created unemployment insurance, aid to dependent children, assistance for the disabled, and most important of all, pensions for older Americans, what we now think of as Social Security. The Second New Deal also helped create the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, which gave unions the right to bargain collectively with employers and which created an enforcement mechanism to allow workers to vote to join unions. Over time, the unions helped raise wages and benefits for millions of workers and increased aggregate purchasing power. In 1938, Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which created the minimum wage and the 40-hour work week. No president had ever before intervened in the economy as extensively or aggressively as Franklin Roosevelt did in the 1930s. And the sheer magnitude of his activism and his legislative achievements awed not only Americans, but much of the world. And yet, this impressive array of achievements that have had a profound and lasting impact on the government's capacity to support and protect its citizens. Despite all that, his achievements did not, in the end, do nearly enough to end the Great Depression. At no time in the first 8 years of the Roosevelt administration did unemployment drop much below 15%. At no time did economic activity reach levels comparable to those of the 1920s, and none of the periods of recovery during the peacetime New Deal lasted very long. So what went wrong? Why did this bold, active, and creative moment in American history prove such a failure at its first and most important task? Why was Roosevelt unable to end the longest depression in the nation's history? Some of the New Deal's most important initiatives were, in fact, active obstacles to recovery. The National Recovery Administration, created in 1933 to help stabilize the volatile economy, was enormously popular for a time, mostly because the NRA created the illusion of bold and forceful action. The NRA sought to organize industries through what were called codes that would allow corporations to cooperate with one another on prices and production. On any other time, this would have been called a cartel, illegal in the United States, but it was allowed under the NRA. The goal of the code authorities was exactly the opposite of what the economy needed. Instead of expanding economic activity, the NRA worked to constrict it, artificially raising prices and reducing production just as purchasing power was failing. It was a deflationary force in an economy already suffering a severe deflation. But the more important failure of the New Deal was what it did not do. The only way to break the economic deadlock that had paralyzed the American economy in the 1930s was to shock it back to life by expanding economic growth, quickly and decisively. But instead, the New Deal wavered and quibbled, spending large sums of money with one hand while reducing spending with the other. One of the first acts Roosevelt asked Congress to pass in 1933 was what he called the Economy Act, which slashed government spending in ways that reduced economic activity. It cut the salaries and, in some cases, the jobs of government employees, and it dramatically reduced payments to World War I veterans, taking $500 million from the economy. In 1937, deluded by a weak economic recovery, Roosevelt, urged on by his Treasury Secretary, set out to balance the budget through severe spending cuts. The result was a sudden and dramatic economic downturn, a recession within the Depression that raised unemployment from roughly 14% in 1937 to 19%. In the aftermath of the 1937-38 recession, Roosevelt quickly changed course. He launched a new $5 billion spending plan to try to shock the economy back to life. And this infusion of funds helped to undo the damage that the 1937 budget cuts helped to create. But it only helped the economy recover to the weak and fragile condition of a year earlier. Nevertheless, the idea of spending as an antidote to recession, an idea that had never found much favor, even among the most progressive figures in the New Deal, now began slowly to seem legitimate. Many American economists were now eagerly reading the theories of John Maynard Keynes and were imagining more robust uses of fiscal and monetary policies to stimulate growth. It's possible, although by no means certain, that even without a war, the New Deal might have embarked on a spending program large enough to push the economy somewhere close to full employment, although that seems unlikely given the strong political opposition to expansive spending and the budget deficits it created. In the end, the Great Depression, an unprecedented crisis that had stubbornly resisted the efforts of two presidential administrations over 12 years to restore prosperity. The Great Depression came to an end only because of the massive and inevitable spending required by the greatest and most terrible war in human history, World War II. Economic orthodoxy, which gave high priority to balanced budgets and fiscal prudence, was a powerful force in the 1930s, despite its failure. The great achievements of the New Deal helped pave the way to an understanding of how to address severe deflation, but it never itself came to a point where he could use the tools at his disposal aggressively enough and effectively enough or quickly enough. And so, there is much to learn from the New Deal, but not just from its achievements. We can also learn from its failures. Now, what lesson can we learn from the 1930s for our own time? The economic crisis that shook the nation beginning in 2008 has continued to plague economies throughout the world, a problem that has especially blighted the lives of working people. It is not yet, and will likely not become, as deep or as long as the Great Depression of the 1930s, but there are many similarities between these two crises. First, reckless credit mechanisms. Traders in the early 2000s invested massively with high levels of debt, sometimes reaching a ratio of debt to assets of 60 to 1. For example, the MF Global Bank that faced bankruptcy just a few months ago had $44 billion of liabilities, in other words, debt, to $1.4 billion of assets when the investment bank finally collapsed. But even more toxic than stock market debt was the home mortgage markets, which has replicated in a different venue the reckless and irresponsible use of debt in much the same way it helped bring down the stock market in 1929. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people, have bought homes with little or no payments, relying almost entirely on debt, which, once the economy unraveled, left millions of homeowners unable to pay their mortgages. Home mortgages have continued to produce defaults on homes for almost 4 years so far into the crisis. And then an orthodox view of economics. Starting in the 1980s, the Keynesianism that helped bring the world out of the Depression in the the 1930s and 40s became obsolete in the views of most economists and financiers. Instead, the old orthodoxy has revived with extraordinary power, a view of economics that assumes that markets are always right and that problems can always be solved by the wisdom of the free market. In our time, the free market has led to a level of reckless financial speculation that economists and financiers could hardly have imagined a generation ago, with tools that have allowed speculators to compile enormous wealth through transactions that move so fast from company to company and from nation to nation, so that many debts and investments last in one place for only days or hours or even seconds. When people made investments, they had no idea where the money went to. And then a failure of regulation in the banking system, in the Federal Reserve Board, in the Security and Exchange Commission, and in many other bodies were deliberately weakened over almost 20 years in response to a frenzy of deregulation that began as early as the 1970s. The weak efforts of the Congress and Obama's modest new regulations have done relatively little to stop the malfeasance of the financial world. And just as in the 1920s, high levels of inequality, which have been growing now for over 30 years and have now reached a level far beyond even the high levels of inequality in the 1920s. In some recent research, the top 1% of the population now own 93% of the wealth. The causes of this inequality are many, some of them beyond the capacity of government, but a significant cause of this new inequality is clearly, at least partly, a result of the new shape of the financial sector. The Obama administration set out to create something like the New Deal in 2009. He attempted in his first 2 years to change at least some of the assumptions that led to the crisis of our time, as they led to the crisis of the 1930s. He helped create a national health bill that would ensure all Americans to be covered, an achievement that generations of presidents had failed to achieve. His stimulus package was the largest in history, far larger than anything the New Deal ever attempted, even when the spending levels were adjusted for inflation. Obama and George W. Bush together shored up the banks and prevented them from collapsing. Obama worked to regulate the markets, or re-regulate the markets for the first time in generations, and for a time it seemed as though Obama might have some of the same political strength and commitment that Franklin Roosevelt himself had. But Obama, so far, has not been able to capture the kind of energy and confidence that Roosevelt himself created and sustained. Franklin Roosevelt's first term had something close to carte blanche in his legislative agenda. Democratic majorities were so large, and the fear of failure was so great, that almost everything Roosevelt wanted was easily passed. Obama has had no such luxury, especially now that Republicans have a majority in the House of Representatives, dominated by perhaps the most conservative, even perhaps radical members of Congress in American history. Obama's $800 billion stimulus package is smaller than many economists believed was necessary, an indication of how deep the recession is, that the $800 billion isn't nearly enough. But it was also poorly structured, and it failed to produce as much economic growth as Obama had hoped for. The President's banking reforms have yet to restore access to credit on terms that might stimulate economic activity. And it is also clear that many of the old orthodoxies that prevented Herbert Hoover from making headway against the Depression are also alive and well again today. The belief that balanced budgets are more important than stimulating growth, the belief that regulation is always bad, the belief that an unfettered market is the only route to prosperity, and the belief that reducing debt during a recession is an imperative. As a result, in the United States and through much of the Western world, many governments have turned toward reducing debt and ignoring the need for economic growth. And so, more than 3 years into Barack Obama's presidency, moving closer to the election every day, the global exuberance that greeted his election has dramatically faded. Economic growth has remained sluggish. Unemployment has dropped from over 10% down to 8.2% by the government's calculation. Improvements, but still a very high number. Most economists believe that the real unemployment level may be closer to 20% of unemployment if we count the many people who have stopped looking for jobs. The signature health care bill is under ferocious attack, facing a battle in the Supreme Court, and the bill itself was weakened by members of the Senate so that the cost-saving elements have been largely stripped away, even before the Supreme Court's decision. His approval ratings had not come above 50% since his first year in office, and he faces an energized, if not particularly organized insurgency, the Tea Party movement, which has helped energize the right and the Republican Party. In the meantime, much of Obama's base, liberals, leftists, and many others, feel deeply disappointed, if not betrayed. It may be that no president since Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt has faced such a stubbornly difficult set of crises as the ones Obama is confronting, none of which he created, but it was probably inevitable that he would be blamed for them, even so. Our crisis today, like that of the Great Depression, offered an opportunity for significant changes in the way our economy works and for a significant role of government in ensuring stability. But that opportunity, so far at least, has not appeared. As in the Great Depression, defenders of orthodoxy are strongly resisting change and successfully clinging to the assumptions of the past. This was not entirely Obama's fault. Franklin Roosevelt, in his first years in office, had also almost no obstacles in the way of his goals. Obama has a less severe crisis, but he also has less ability to control events and to achieve his hopes. Only a great war ended the Great Depression of the 1930s. Without such a war in our time, the economic crisis has been much slower to improve. As the United States moves toward a presidential election, the future of the American and much of the world economy will hang on whether the United States will continue to try to stimulate a stronger economy or whether it will move to austerity. The future of the next years, both for the economy and for the election, will hang on that decision. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to answer questions or hear comments. I know it's a big room and it's intimidating, but feel free. Yes?
How come the current military action hasn't been longer? And I don't know if it costs the same war, but we have not seen the same economic results over a longer period of time.
The question is why are not the wars of more recent years why have they not stimulated the economy? Well, they probably have stimulated the economy to a small amount, but if you think about World War II, where there was almost no military at all, and over the course of 2 or 3 years, there was an extraordinary effort to build ships and airplanes and weapons, and it was an enormous investment that put everyone to work. Today, the military is already so enormous and has so much material and so many weapons that even the high level of the budget of the Defense Department isn't enough to raise the economy very much. So just too much was already built already, and it's not enough new building to end this very difficult recession. Question?
What would be the elements of the Brinkley plan?
The Brinkley plan? There is no Brinkley plan. That's for someone else to know. So, yes, there. Yes.
Can you explain the pragmatic approach that FDR was utilizing?
What does it mean, you mean, to have a pragmatic? Pragmatic means not locked into a view of what the country needs. It means that you try things, and if they don't work, you try something else. That's what pragmatism is. You don't have strong commitments to what you need to do. You need to test everything that you do against what it actually achieves. So there are lots of people who believe, for example, that the only thing that the free market, for example, is a kind of religion in the financial world. A pragmatic view would be to look at the financial world and try to decide whether this is working well or not. That's what Roosevelt tried to do, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, rather than picking out an ideology and sticking with it. That's pragmatism. Now, I'm sorry, a little louder. That's a tough question, but let me start with what you sort of ended with. What should you be doing if you were trying to think about how to make a career for yourself, how you think the country should be governed? Should people go into science or medicine, or should people go into government or administration, or, God forbid, into academia? I think that people should decide what they do with their lives depending on what they think they are best at and what they are most interested in. I don't think there's any, I wouldn't say that everybody should be doing things that, I don't think everybody should feel that they should go into science or engineering or economics or practical areas. I think it's also important to have humanities, history, literature. So I think as you think about your own life, you should think about what you find most interesting and most important to you. There are plenty of people going into engineering and science and medicine. There are plenty of room for other things too. Yes.
Along the same lines, my question would be, the school holiday tariff that caused such negative impact in the 30s, should we look at the impacts of our overseas imports on our economy today? And that most of our manufacturing is no longer here in the United States. And that's basically the reason that I'm in college now, that there's no factory menial jobs available.
Well, that's true. The Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1932 was one of the most, one of the strongest tariff in the 20th century. And almost everyone now believes that the Smoot-Hawley tax was a tremendous mistake in the time of the Great Depression. It meant not only did it keep out imports, but it also made it impossible to export, and that's why it was such a mistake. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
So most of our manufacturing is no longer here in the United States.
Well, that's true, and that's been going on for about 30 years now, and it's partly because the industry around the world is very competitive, and most countries, most industrial countries, have much lower salaries for people working in industry. And so the well-paid industrial workers of the 50s and 60s and early 70s began to diminish starting in the 70s. And a lot of factories have moved out of the northern states where unions were strong, and others were moving down into the south where there were fewer unions. But even more than that, so much of American industry has moved out of the United States and into other countries that have lower wages for workers. And that's I'm not sure I would call it a failure. It might be something that was inevitable. But it certainly did lower the levels of middle class and working class people. That's certainly.
May I have a question?
Yes.
I've been waiting patiently.
I'm sorry, let's see.
I didn't have the pleasure of hearing the beginning of your lecture, but from the bit that I did hear, my question is, why did you feel it necessary to compare President Obama's administrative failures to those things that were involved with the Great Depression? And also, do you feel that much of his opposition is not based on his ethics and his work performance, but due to his race?
Due to his?
His race.
Oh. Well, I wouldn't say that race is not an issue for Obama, and there certainly is a lot of opposition to him that probably has some connection to race, even though people don't do it very openly. But I think Obama's bigger problem, from my view, is that he's a very intelligent man, and I think he's been, for the whole, a good president. But he hasn't. I don't think he's been as good a communicator as I thought he would be, and that's a very important part of being president. I think he's trying harder now as the election is coming up, and it's surprising to me because he was such a dramatically powerful orator during his campaign, and once he became president, he seemed to sort of shrink in a way. I will say, I think Obama probably has had the toughest role that any president has had since Franklin Roosevelt. And so I don't really blame him as a person that he hasn't made as much progress as he hoped on the economy. And of course, he has tremendous opposition. But I think some of this is his own. I think that if I had one real complaint about President Obama, is the way he dealt with the health care bill, which passed in 2010 and disappeared from the president and from almost everyone. There was no explanation to most Americans of what this new bill meant. And so the health care bill, or Obamacare as the Republicans call it, they're the ones who described it it's the Republicans who told people what the bill was supposed to be, but in fact, much of what they said was completely wrong. So I think that's an example of why communication is so important for a president. And I think Obama has not been particularly good at that, even though I admire him in many ways. Yes.
President Obama will be back in office for another 4 years, and if not, do you think that's
well, obviously, the Democratic candidate is obviously going to be Obama. And if I had to bet, I would bet that Obama will win, although I'm not at all certain about that.
I think you're right.
If he's not reelected, the president will probably be Romney, and that would be a very different president. Yes.
Should the president use the FDR concept of the brain trust, and would that more or less help the economy further to develop?
Well, he did have the brain trust was mostly a brain trust of economists, and Obama has had a group of economists who worked very closely with him on the crisis. So it's very similar, actually. What they would call it the brain trust, but it's a bunch of very smart, very distinguished economists, including Larry Summers, who was the Secretary of Treasury and the President of Harvard. I think he picked the wrong people, and I think that's one of the problems that have made the economy not growing as much as it should. So that's my view of this. The brain trust is a phrase that was used in the 1930s to describe the advisors to Franklin Roosevelt who worked with him mostly on the economy. It was a group of 4 or 5 people, mostly from Columbia, and they were called the brain trust when at the beginning of Franklin Roosevelt's administration. Yes?
What stage do you put our economy right now?
What's the...
What stage? Are we past the recession, or what do you think we replace it?
Well, I can't see that. I can't predict the future. I think the economy is growing slowly, very slowly, and it slowed a bit in the last month or so. It doesn't mean it might not start up again in a week or 2 or a month. I mean, if probably the most powerful measure of what the economy is like is unemployment. So when this crisis began, unemployment moved up to somewhere around 11%. It's now down to 8.2. So that's progress, and it's been moving down slowly ever since. But I think in politics, 8.2% isn't something you want to run on. I think the slowness of the reduction of unemployment is a problem for Obama, because by November, if the unemployment level is somewhere around 8%, that's going to be a problem for him. I think he probably would win even with that, but it's not for sure. So I think the biggest problem that he faces is the slowness of the reduction of unemployment. And as I said, the 8.2% of unemployment, that's the government way to measure unemployment. It doesn't count all the people who are unemployed who aren't trying to find jobs anymore, who aren't going to these government offices to get unemployment checks and getting efforts to get once you get to the end of your unemployment unemployment insurance, you're off the books. So I think the unemployment is actually much higher at all times than the official government percentages of unemployment. Yes?
Do you foresee the intransigence of the Tea Party last summer in the budget ceiling debate as being almost equivalent to, if you will, the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812, as discredited the Republican Party in the 2012 election?
Well, they're not. The Tea Party is not trying to secede from the Union, as the Hartford Hartford Convention wanted to have New England split off from the United States. But the Tea Party certainly believes that the government is completely moving in the wrong direction, and they, I think, are imagining a government that looks something like the 1920s. In fact, the Tea Party people, especially the most conservative of them, they revere Calvin Coolidge because he was the last president to have have no debt. But in the process began the process of the Great Depression coming along, which came just after he left office. So I think well, I think I said enough. I think the Tea Party is not as powerful as it was before. It's moved into the Congress. Some of those people are Tea Party people. A lot of them are just conservative people who want lower taxes and fewer regulations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to be what the campaign is going to be about. Yes. Yes.
Hi. I wanted to share something with the person that asked, what should we go into? I thought your answer was good. I mean, we can't all be legislators, we can't all be presidents, but there is a group right here on campus called Democracy House that you can become involved with. We act on I'm a student, I'm involved with them, they partner with AmeriCorps. They act on a local level to do volunteer work to address some of the issues that are problems in our society. And we just had a presentation actually this morning from someone from the citizenscampaign.com that talks about how you can get trained online for 15 or 30 minutes of training on how you can become a citizen legislator, a citizen journalist, a political party committee person, an appointed official in your town. I know in my town of South River there was a young man, he was barely out of high school, I don't even think he was finished with college, he got on to the Board of Ed. So I think personally, as a person of more advanced years, I've been through the Reagan administration, I've been through both Bushes. I'd say become a knowledgeable citizen. I mean, even if you don't go as far as getting on your Board of Ed or something, try to not just listen to the news sources that confirm your biases, and try to find out about issues. They're complicated sometimes. And then vote intelligently, not by party. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? In the back, I think. Yes. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, you said the two wars helped the economy. Do you think this rhetoric that we have of another war with Iran, do you think it's just economic that we want to go into another war to get out of the recession?
I don't think these wars have been driven by the economy. I don't think the wars have actually helped the economy. So no, I don't think that's the reason. I don't believe in these wars, but I don't think it's because of economics. I think it's because of other reasons. Yes.
Your thoughts on FDR's second Bill of Rights? You know, most of the things that he was striving for had been accomplished, but the main thing was that would be medical care that was not accomplished. And
Truman tried it, Eisenhower tried it, Kennedy tried it, Johnson tried it, got some of it. Nixon tried it. I don't think Ford did it. Carter tried. Reagan didn't. Clinton did and failed. And now Obama, who may or may not fail. So this is one of the tough things for 2 generations now or more. Anyone else?
I know you agree with me that there's going to be a lot of discussion and debate and discourse about this talk. I saw some raised eyebrows when you were speaking now. So thank you so much for bringing this to us.